It is the 90s, and there is time for pinball.
We've seen pinball video games go from extremely basic attempts to something that could almost rival a real table.
A low-end table perhaps, but a real table nonetheless.
And the technical innovations we saw in the 20th century's final decade flung the doors wide open for proper pinball simulations. The arcade perfect experience direct to your own TV. Or monitor, as the case may be. To kick us off, we'll take a look at someone biting off a little more than they could chew. What the heck am I looking at? Well, first person pinball is a pretty descriptive title. It's certainly first person something, and supposedly there's some pinball involved? Not that you'd know just from watching this footage, that is. Honestly, calling this a game is charitable at best. You barely have any control over what's going on, mainly because you can't flipping see what's going on. The ball appears to fly around at complete random, and I mean complete random. Several times I saw it go into the drain, or what I thought was the drain, only to pop straight back out again. If you can work out where the flippers are, you can potentially give the ball a good whack. But when it's running at this ultra smooth frame rate of maybe 6 FPS, it becomes a little more difficult. And then you lose a life for seemingly no reason. Great freaking game. Imagine paying 30 quid for this.
Now we've got that out of the way, let's see what the Amiga was really capable of.
Whenever you think of pinball on the Amiga, this is probably the first game that springs to mind. Pinball Dreams was a hugely successful sim and fondly remembered today, along with its sequels Pinball Fantasies and Pinball Illusions. These were developed by a studio called Digital Illusions, who are now best known for a little game called Battlefield. What are they calling themselves now? Dice? Something like that? Pinball Dreams is a very attractive game. The tables are very well realised with well-defined components that make it look like a real table, to the extent that the Amiga was capable of at least. And the physics are the best yet, as you'd hope. They can still be a bit iffy at times. The ball apparently has a flat edge which means it can get stuck, but they're generally serviceable. You hit the ball and it usually goes where you expect it to. Unfortunately, the tables are all a bit sparse. They tend to each have the same elements but in a slightly different arrangement. I think it might have been better for them to work on one really good table rather than 4 alright tables. We definitely need to talk about this screen scrolling, because it became the de facto standard for pinball games of this style. Is it just me, or is the screen scrolling a real issue? As in, I can't see where I'm aiming, so I never end up with a decent score. Honestly, the scrolling really does hamper my enjoyment of these games. I won't belabour the point, but let it be known, scrolling sucks. And it makes me feel a bit motion sick. Pinball Fantasies tables feel a lot more feature packed. I just kinda wish that there was more, fantasy to it. I appreciate they were probably going for realism here, but the table design just isn't strong enough for me to manage that. I don't know, maybe my standards are just too darn high. Pinball Dreams was a formative game in the video pinball scene, and a lot of developers wanted to try their hand at a game in the same sort of style. One of these was Slam Tilt, a game that has demo scene written all over it. Just check out these DMD animations for crying out loud. I'd be very surprised if the developers hadn't been to at least one assembly event. Anyway, Slam Tilt is pretty damn similar to Dreams. The graphics look much improved to me, with almost a pre-rendered effect. Pretty incredible. I also feel like the tables are a lot more involved. There just seems to be a lot more going on. And it's easier to aim, because I can actually see where I'm going. Yeah, this is the Windows version released in 1997. From what I can tell, the game is identical, it just runs in a higher resolution. I suspect whether you prefer Pinball Dreams or Slam Tilt is a matter of taste. Slam Tilt's definitely the one for me though. The physics feel a lot better, and the themes surrounding each table are a bit more coherent. Before we move on from the Pinball Dreams school of thought, let's not ignore what was happening on the consoles around this time. The Mega Drive was a bit of a hotspot for pinball, as we'll see, and Psycho Pinball by Codemasters was no exception. Once again, it boasts 4 tables, all of which have a unique theme but feel roughly the same to play. The Psycho table is interesting, as completing objectives allows you to traverse to the other 3 tables, a novel concept and not something you often see in pinball games. One thing I will say is that the physics are a notable improvement once again. There are also a handful of minigames which break up the action a little. even if they do feel a bit out of place. Not a lot else to say, to be honest. It's just another well-made 16-bit pinball game, and if the Mega Drive's your thing, you can't really go wrong. Let's rewind slightly. In the early 90s there was a bit of a feud between Amiga gamers and DOS gamers, as far as I can tell from anecdotal evidence anyway. Long story short, Epic Mega Games saw what Digital Illusions were doing with Pinball Dreams, and thought that DOS could do all that and more. They quickly put together a game called Silver Ball, which was followed up by one of the juggernauts of shareware gaming, Epic Pinball. It's okay. Epic Pinball was one of those games that they just kept adding to over the years. There were multiple different table packs produced for it between 1993 and 95, culminating in the full CD-ROM release which you see before you. And in what seems like an Epic Mega Games tradition, the free bit is perhaps the best part. I don't mean to diss on Epic Pinball, as I know it has its fans, but I really don't rate it much at all. There are just too damn many tables and they're all very, very sparse. Look at Excalibur for example, there's nothing here! I moaned about Dreams being a bit light on content, but good grief. Whether it's true or not, Android definitely feels like the one that's had the most effort put into it. A bit like how episode 1 of Jazz Jackrabbit is the best that game has to offer. I appreciate how the status display appears as an overlay rather than taking up the chunk of the screen to itself, freeing up more screen real estate for the table. The physics are also very nice, if a bit floaty. Sometimes there are weird situations where you seem to lose your ball unfairly, but in general, not bad. What's this, Coral Reefs? Nice one, Epic.
Now I've been asking for more fantasy elements on these tables, but maybe I'll be eating my words after playing Sonic Spinball.
Right, let's have a think about how best to open this Sonic-themed pinball game. Most Sonic games, in fact all the ones I've played, open with sunshine, jolly music and an invitation to go running at top speed in some kind of green-hued environment.
So, what we're saying? They've done Hilly Meadows already, they've done the jungle, Sonic CD's just come out, so Palm Tree Panic might be a good candidate. But let's see what they actually did.
The sewers! Yeah, that's what we're all thinking of, right? Ugh. If I had to describe Spinball in one word, it'd be tedious. It's almost like they never played a Sonic game. You know, Sonic, known for being an extremely smooth and high-speed platformer. Put him in a game that's traditionally smooth and high-speed and suddenly it's like treacle? You have a little control over Sonic while he's airborne, but it doesn't help much, especially since you can't see where you're going. The scrolling in this is even worse than before because it goes from side to side as well. It doesn't help that the table is way over complex. I have no idea what it is I'm supposed to be doing, outside of collecting 3 Chaos Emeralds.
Now, I must add at this juncture that there's a balance to be found in pinball games. Too little to do and you feel like you're just hitting targets, too much to do and you feel like you're overwhelmed. Take a look at the highest rated physical pin games, and you'll see what I mean.
I keep hitting these targets, very few of which seem to have any effect. There are these big metal worms and blowing them up doesn't seem to have any effect. Clock alert? What does this mean? Cleanup complete? Well, that's a relief. The game's getting bogged down in its narrative, something that, once again, Sonic games have never traditionally worried about.
Or pinball tables for that matter.
It's the anti-Sonic game. So, because I can't seem to get past this first level, partly out of sheer frustration at the sluggishness of Sonic, I put in a cheat to try out the other 2 levels. It doesn't get any better.
I think I've identified the issue. The problem is it's a pinball game trying to be a platformer. Or maybe it's a platformer trying to be a pinball game. As we'll later discover, there are ways and means of doing that. But Sonic Spinball ain't ways and means of doing anything.
Play this game if you want to experience how old people feel when they play Halo. The Mega Drive, for all the great pins it had, also had its equal share of crap ones. And most of them were Crüe Ball. I really have no idea what's going on with this one. There seems to be some pinball involved, but only on a technical level. Otherwise it's just a mishmash of weird Motley Crue references. My main question is, why does this even exist? And why does Kiss Pinball exist either?
I'm honestly puzzled by this. Did these aging rock stars really think that video pinball was their salvation?
There was a physical Kiss table released in 1979, which further adds to the mystery surrounding why this game was made. As it looks like some degree of effort has been put into this one, let's try and give it a proper review. There are 2 tables involved. One involves Kiss concerts, the other... Ow! What is that? The thing is, there's not much here to review. Outside the amateurish artwork and irrelevant voice clips, it's just an extremely average pinball game. These were a dime a dozen in the mid-2000s.
The real question is, where's the table based on Jethro Tull? Here's my plan. The entire table starts underwater. After draining it with a trick shot, the playfield's covered in magnets that grab your ball at random intervals, occasionally smacking it against the glass. About halfway through you can lock one ball, and then the game freezes for 10 minutes while telling you all about hairs. The winner is the person who realises it's all an elaborate joke.
The physics are serviceable, the objectives are unobjectionable. It's just yet another crummy video pinball. It's also a scroller, because apparently we're not quite out of the hole just yet.
We will defeat you.
So far we've seen a lot of 2D overhead games. Makes sense, that's what these systems were capable of.
But think back to the NES and Pinbot with its angled viewpoint.
It took us a little while to get back to that idea, but once it got established, it became the new de facto standard for video pin games.
Out of the way, all you other 2D pinballs. This is the real deal. Welcome. No more scrolling, no more dodgy physics. Pro Pinball is about as lifelike as you'd hope for in 1996. Making use of some immense pre-rendered graphics with the full 16-bit gamut afforded by a quality graphics card, Pro Pinball looks and feels amazing. Sure, it's dated nowadays, but in the same way as Toy Story was eye-poppingly beautiful back in its day, so too was Pro Pinball.
But what's this? You only get one table? Why, they must think we were born yesterday if they think we'd fall for such a rip-off.
Actually, after playing a while, you'll come to realise that this game has the combined enjoyment of any of the previous 4-table collections we've seen thus far, and then some. You see, the developers went for the Daytona USA method here. Lower quantity, but higher quality. It invites the player to spend their time with a single really good table, and there's enough challenge and skill ceiling here that replayability really isn't an issue. The Web is the first game in the series, and it's a cyberpunk action thriller that follows a biker, and there's an evil lady as well, and maybe a few other bikers and a space station? Let's face it, story in pinball games is important, but they're always a bit light on the details. You can tell they still had some kinks to work out with this debut attempt. In general, it's a lot of fun to play, but the physics still feel a bit watery, and some of these shots are almost impossible to consciously make. The far left saucer and the far right ramp are the main culprits, but the centre kickout is tricky to hit as well. Something I must mention is the audio. In previous games we've looked at, the audio's been pretty good, but there's always been something missing from these games that's been in real pinball for ages. Speech. And the Web has it in spades.
Extra ball!
Outstanding.
The voice acting is cheesy as all heck, just as it should be. Anyway, I can't spend too long on one game. We have 3 more to look at. Here's where Pro Pinball grew the beard, so to speak. The physics are almost perfect, the 3D visuals have seen a bit of an upgrade, and it's just so immensely playable that it feels like it hasn't aged a day. Well, maybe it's aged a little. Still looks a bit plasticky. Timeshock is a cyberpunk action thriller, but with added time travel. Some nutty professor in the distant future has managed to accidentally destroy all of time and space, and you have to run around cleaning up the mess.
Sounds like every quest in RuneScape.
Timeshock is often considered the best of the series, and for good reason. Each time zone presents its own unique challenges. And while they do essentially boil down to hit this ramp, then hit this other target, then shoot the crystal, or variations thereof, it's the narrative that makes these tasks so much more engaging. And the cheesy voice acting, and the music! The first time you see the time travel sequence is mind-blowing. If I had to pick a favourite Pro Pinball, it'd probably be this one. Big Race USA is a road trip comedy starring a taxi, heading out to compete in a race across the country.
Could be a cyberpunk action thriller, depending on how you look at it.
While you're in the city, you can pick up passengers, compete in smaller races, and throw grenades around inside airports.
I hate lines.
I don't get it. To travel between cities, you gotta hit the road, and that's where the Darth Vader police car lives.
The sheriff is not as forgiving as I am.
There's also a video mode where you have to ram other cars off the road. Seems pretty barbaric considering cars are living creatures in this universe. Does this make the taxi a mass murderer? A homicidal maniac? A cop killer? I love the toy cars that pop up, and the voice acting seems a lot more fitting this time round. It totally feels like it could be a real cartoon on TV, though it's definitely more Cosgrove Hall than Disney.
However, I will concede that it doesn't really know entirely what it wants to be. Is it a buddy comedy? Is it an action thing? Is it a horror? And why does the police car sound like Darth Vader?
Finally, we have Fantastic Journey, a steampunk action thriller.
Steampunk's basically Victorian cyberpunk, so I think I can guess where the writer's strengths were.
Hello.
I've grown more appreciative of this one the more I play it. It's absolutely the best looking of the lot, with much smoother animations and more realistic lighting effects. The plastic toys look like actual plastic, and the DMD has a bit of colour to it this time round. The physics are also the most lifelike they've ever been, and it's probably the only time I'd say motion blur has been used to good effect. One thing I will suggest is that the DMD animations are a bit distracting, and because they're in colour it does tend to get a bit busy around the top of the screen.
Now I'll admit, I really love these games. To me they're the final word in classic video pinball, but it didn't stop everybody else from trying to one-up them.
Now let's take a look at the opposite approach.
Colony table activated. To start bonus events, hit the glider twice. Good luck.
While the Pro Pinball series is aimed squarely at ultra realism, Sierra's 3D Ultra Pinball is an example of the fantastical style of pinball I've mentioned before. After all, isn't the point of video games to experience something we'd never be able to in real life? 3D Ultra brings us back to the multiple tables per game idea, but with each one based around a singular theme. In each game it's possible to traverse all 3 tables by completing certain objectives. Not that I've figured out how to do so. That's not the fault of the game though. No, all I can blame the game for is having lousy physics and some dreadful table design. I will say that playing 3D Ultra Pinball is a spectacle, but it's a frustrating spectacle. The first game, subtitled Fastest Pinball in Space, takes place in what appears to be a moon base with a residential zone, a mine, and a command HQ. Each of these tables makes use of the horizontal space by having essentially 3 play areas, each with different targets to hit. And here comes problem number 1. You see, the flippers on the left and right are modelled with perspective in mind. You know, just like how 3D is supposed to work. But the physics don't seem to take that into account, so your ball will routinely go straight through the flippers. Bit of a pain in the arse, you would have thought we'd be past that by now. Problem number 2 comes when you realise that these tables, for all their graphical fidelity, are a struggle to play. You're given a couple of objectives when the game starts, showing you where you should be aiming for, but actually hitting any of these targets is an exercise in futility, as there will undoubtedly be 1,000,001 obstacles in the way. Just try hitting the central door on the colony table with all those bumpers in the way. The bumpers that will bounce your ball straight into the drain, might I add. I think I'm also allowed to complain about the frame rate, given that the other games I've played have been extremely smooth and slick, whatever other shortcomings they may have had. This one, however, is more like Sonic Spinball. It's slow and choppy and the animations are subpar. Probably the smoothest thing in this entire game is the hang glider. It's a shame because there's some really good concepts here. You can find a variety of modes by hitting all these different targets, and of course there's a good helping of cheesy voice acting as well. But it's let down by those awful physics. Hey look, they remade Ping Pong up here.
Hopefully they fix these things up for the sequel.
Actually yes, Creep Night went a good way to alleviate some of the issues.
Name your poison. Choose to play one table or all at once.
Welcome to our castle. Stay for a spell. Aiming for the castle gate.
It's still got a frame rate like sandpaper and the targets are still a ball ache to hit, but it generally feels a lot more fluid than the previous game did. On the first table at least. Tables 2 and 3 have their own problems, but let's discuss the positives first. I like these ghosts and goblins that roam around the table. It's fun trying to hit them even if the ball sails straight through them a lot of the time. They're also stylistically incongruent from the rest of the table, though this does make them easier to see, so hey, I'll let them off. Anyway, table 2. Jeez, this is awful. Just try doing anything here, because if the ball isn't going in that pool, it's not going anywhere. You can try and get it to go up to the other tables, but it'll only slide straight back down again. I think this highlights the value of having one excellent table over 3 crap tables. Table 3 has the exact same issue. You just end up repeating exactly the same things over and over because the targets are just too fiddly to hit and the bumpers hate you. Also, there's this bizarre Simon Says minigame that has no place here whatsoever. Wouldn't it be fun if this was done with pinball mechanics, rather than using the mouse? If you want to feel like a complete idiot, play Creep Night. But if you want to feel like a bold adventurer, play Lost Continent. Here's where they stopped farting around and actually produced a decent pin experience. This time around there are a whole slew of tables. The main 3 are present and accounted for, but there are also smaller in-between tables with only 1 or 2 objectives each. The idea is to play through each one in sequence to see the full pre-rendered dodgily animated adventure. Whoa. Well, I say that, but the animations are much stronger this time around. Those and the table design really make this one a cut above the rest of the series. The physics are still crap and the frame rate's still choppy, but I guess you can't have it all. And the ball still frequently goes through everything. In short, it's still no Pro Pinball, but it has its own appeal in being a completely unrealistic game. And for finally managing to pull it off to some degree of playability, Dynamix gets a hat tip off me.
In the world of physical tables, licensing was, and is, a massive thing. Pretty much half the tables you'd see in an average arcade were based on an existing property. That line of thinking got its way to video pinball as well, though in a somewhat more limited fashion.
Hot on the heels of the 3D pinball sim craze, Interplay decided it'd be a good idea to fart out a pinball game based on Star Trek the original series, for DOS, in 1998. As a comparison, Fallout 2 was also published, by Interplay, in 1998. Did that get a DOS version? Did it balls? In fact, DOS was practically dead for the average consumer by late 1997. What was going on here? I don't know, but it's not a good pinball game, that's for sure. There are 3 tables included, the first of which is based on Captain Kirk. And the ladies, because how hilarious, Kirk was a massive womanizer. So it's a very average pinball table. Nothing Star Trek about it whatsoever, outside of the random voice clips that are completely out of place. The references are surface at best, and there doesn't seem to be any music to speak of. What are these physics? We're back in the Stone Age here, or the Wood Age one might say. These are reminiscent of what we saw in Raster Blaster. And keep in mind this is post Pinball Dreams, post Pro Pinball, post 3D Ultra, and post Star Trek The Next Generation Pinball. If you're going to make a Star Trek based game, why not base it off one of the greatest pins of all time? Anyway, the table isn't very interesting, and the same goes for Kapla, the second of the 3.
We Klingons have a reputation.
At least it's got a giant, entirely unconvincing Klingon head that does absolutely nothing. Circus, Voltaire and Funhouse have little to worry about here.
But it's table number 3 where the crap factor really sets in.
It's so awful. The table itself is threadbare, but the voice samples absolutely ruin any fun you might have with this. Well, it might raise a chuckle from how utterly abysmal it is.
And this table's 2 players only, not something you often see. Although if they were trying to innovate, this was probably the wrong place to do it.
There are a handful of other licensed pins for Windows. I'm not sure what it was about pinball that had game developers in the 90s whipped into a frenzy like fresh cream with added popping candy, but evidently there was a market for it.
I'd suggest it's because all these veteran developers grew up playing pinball and arcade games. So, as with all these 3D arcade remakes I keep coming across, they'd naturally want to try their hand at digitising these youthful pastimes.
Balls of Steel is a slightly disappointing game. I'll be honest, I was only here for the Duke Nukem table, which, again, is just a mediocre table with some Duke stuff slapped onto it. Almost feels like a cash grab. Which, this being a Duke game, could be a satirical expose of the rampant state of crap licensed pin games.
Or it could just be a rubbish video pinball.
Microsoft Pinball Arcade is an interesting one. A digital museum of old tables, covering 60 years of pinball history from 1931 to 1992. It's interesting to see the development of these tables, especially for wannabe historians such as myself. Included a Baffle Ball, the first widely successful pinball table, Humpty Dumpty, the first tabletop flippers, 6 of them in fact, and a few others that are representative of the time that they were released. It runs at an excruciatingly low frame rate, and the games themselves aren't exactly the most engaging tables out there. So this really is a digital museum rather than something you can have a lot of fun with. Addiction Pinball! Again, I only played one of the tables included with this package, which happens to be based on worms. And it's not bad at all. The theme makes perfect sense and is implemented well within the table. It runs smoothly, the animations are fun, and it looks like it could be a real table. Not so fond of the music, but I guess you can't win them all. Also, since I can't really fit it in anywhere else, Mega Pinball. This is what happens when budget developers try to make a 3D pinball game. It's so naff that I can't bear to spend more than a minute talking about it, so I won't. Before we move away completely from 2D, let's just have a quick look at one last game for Windows, specifically Windows XP. I'm sure anyone of a certain age will recognise this one. Well, here's a bit of trivia for you. This game was originally part of a 3-table set called Full Tilt, and was published by Maxis. Yep, the same guys behind The Sims. The original Full Tilt table runs in a higher resolution and has noticeably better graphical fidelity. It's smoother and a lot easier to play, I find. As for the table itself, it's very good. Lots of fun when you're at your grandma's house without an internet connection in the early 2000s. The objectives are easy to work out, so you can rack up a decently high score even if you're no good at pinball. And there's music, which apparently not many people know about.
It's a bit naff though.
The other 2 tables in Full Tilt don't look to have had the same love and attention. Space Cadet really is the standout of the bunch, and definitely worth tracking down.
Video pinball's certainly come a long way in just a few years.
The advent of the ahead of its time Amiga, followed by the more powerful hardware of the consoles and PCs, gave developers room to explore and populate the tables with more features, more modes, better music, and sampled speech.
We were closer than ever to attaining real pinball in our homes without having to fill a whole room with expensive tables. But do you notice something missing? See if you can work it out, and join me next time where we'll follow pinball right up to the present day. See you then.